Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we have how to play Tawantinsuyu. This is a worker placement game with a lot going on, but we've got it all in this video for you. We're going to teach you everything you need to know so you can play. Be sure to check out the timestamps below so you can find the exact rule you're looking for. Before we get down to the table, I want to mention our sponsor, Board Game Co. This is a great website where you can buy, sell, and trade games. They have a great selection to choose from. If you're just looking to build out your collection, just trying to find, exactly the right game to get the perfect collection, they can probably help you out. They also have a feature where they will buy games from you. If you are trying to get rid of some games in your collection, they can help you out. Don't sell 6 games to 6 different people, shipping them to 6 different places. Ship them all to the same place, Board Game Co. Very easy system to use there. And then of course they have their trade feature where if you have a Board Game Geek username, you can set up a trade list on Board Game Geek. Many people do that anyway. You then go over to Board Game Co, drop your username into Board Game Co. It will compare your trade list with their stock, build a custom trade list right there on their website. Makes it very easy to facilitate a trade. If you do check them out, click on the link in the description below so they know I sent you over there. Board Game Co. makes it easy to buy, sell, and trade your way into a better collection. All right, let's get down to the table and we're going to teach you how to play Tawantinsuyu. On the board, there are 4 conquest regions found in the 4 corners of the board. Here, 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 and here. This area of the board is known as the temple. Nomads are found here, and the village is here. And casualties of war are placed here. The central part of the board is broken up into 5 sections, which are triangles, with the point of the triangle being here, coming down to each corner, like this. The largest ring of the central section is known as the bottom terrace. The next ring is the middle terrace, and the next ring is the top terrace. Every area of the board where a section and a terrace combine is known as a segment. So from here to here is a segment, here to here is a segment, here to here is a segment, and so on. And the most central area of the board is known as the Conquest. To begin setup, first the players lay out the main game board, as you see here, in the center of the play area, and place all resources next to the board to form the general supply. During the game, anytime the word resource is used, it refers to corn, potatoes, stone, or gold. Gold is a wild resource that can be spent as any other resource. Sometimes the game may refer to food, in which case it's only talking about corn or potatoes. Next, each player takes their 5 step markers. They place a scoring marker on the 10 space and their temple marker on the bottommost space of the temple track. Next, they take the Conquest, rotate it randomly, and place it face up like this. However, if it's their first game, it's recommended that the Conquest is played as it's printed on the board, so you could put this out if you wanted to, or just play as it is here. If playing a 2-player game, remove 1 worker of each color from the game. If playing a 3-player game, remove 2 workers of each color. The players then place 2 workers of each color in the draw bag, shake the draw bag up, and then each player will draw 2 workers from the bag. If a player happens to draw 2 of the same color, they set those aside, draw 1 more from the bag, and then place 1 of the duplicate colors back in the bag. Once all players have drawn 2 workers from the bag, add all remaining workers to the bag. The player then randomly draws workers from the bag and places them on the village spaces on the board, forming a queue between the potato and corn icons. Keep in mind the game board shows how many workers should be placed based on the number of players. So in a 2-player game, this is as far as the players would fill the board. Next, place a number of workers in the nomad spaces, again paying attention to these icons. If playing with only 2 players, place a randomly drawn worker on each space in the top terrace that has a 2-player symbol like this one or this one. There are 2-player symbols on other areas of the board, but they will be blocked after the first festival. Next, separate all the buildings by type, either production or passive. Shuffle the production and passive buildings into separate stacks as you see here and reveal 2 buildings of each type. This is known as the building market. Shuffle the army cards next and place them face down in a deck near the building market. Separate all the statues by their icons and lay them out near the building market. Next, the players need to set aside all the weaving tiles like this. They want to find the 4 starting weaving tiles that have this brownish background instead of this sort of grayish background like that. These are the 4 starting weaving tiles. You can also tell that they're starting weaving tiles because on the front it has SW for starting weaving. SW 1 through 4. Set these aside. Then in a 3-player game, set aside all the weaving tiles that are labeled as 4-player there. And in a 2-player game, also set aside all the tiles that say 3+ there. Any weaving tiles that were set aside based on player count are removed from the game. Shuffle all remaining weaving tiles into a face-down stack and reveal the top one. At this point, the last player to harvest a vegetable becomes the first player. Alternatively, choose the first player randomly in your own way. Once the first player is chosen, players choose in turn order from the 4 starting weaving tiles. Any starting weaving tiles remaining are returned to the box. Each player now receives 2 stone from the supply. The God deck is shuffled and each player receives 8 God cards. Each player then chooses 3 to stay in their hand and plays the remaining 5 for their benefits. Players will receive their benefits from the God cards in reverse turn order. It's possible during this procedure at the beginning of the game that the building market will be accessed. If so, the building market is only replenished after all players have completed this procedure. Once all players have finished receiving the benefits of their God cards, those cards are shuffled back into the deck. Make sure to leave enough room next to the God deck for a central offer which will be created throughout the game. Finally, be sure to keep the festival tile nearby. Before a player takes their first turn, they start by placing the High Priest on any one of the spaces on the core concha. This can be placed on an empty space or even on a space occupied by one or more other High Priests. This placement only serves to determine the starting position of the player's High Priest and should not be confused with the moving the High Priest secondary action, which we'll discuss later. On a player's turn, they must choose one of the 2 following options, either place a worker or perform 2 different secondary actions. If the player chooses to place a worker, they discard either 1 God card or 1 gold to place a worker from their supply to the board. If the player chooses to perform secondary actions, they can do 2 of the following 4 actions in any order: move the High Priest, praying, training, or recruiting. Additionally, at any point on a player's turn, they can discard an army card to gain the resource depicted on them. There is no limit to the number of times a player may do this during their turn. At the end of a player's turn, they will have the chance to recruit more workers, but they can never end their turn with more than 2 in their supply. We'll discuss recruiting at the end of the turn in detail a little bit later. If at the end of a player's turn the village is empty, a festival is triggered, and we'll discuss that a little bit more later as well. At the end of the player's turn, if there are any empty spaces in the building market, it is replenished. On the board, spaces are any of these God symbols. Next to them are tasks. As an action, the player may place a worker from their supply on an empty space. The cost to do this is a matching God card, so this symbol matches this symbol, or 1 gold. Additionally, the player must pay food costs for roaming and descending based on their worker's placement compared to the position of their high priest. The roaming cost is based on the distance between the section the player's high priest is standing in and the space in question. As we previously mentioned, a section is 1/5 of the board, essentially one side of the hill. It costs 0 food to place within the same section as the high priest. So if this is the black player placing this worker, then the roaming cost is 0 because this worker is placed on the same side of the hill as their high priest. It costs 1 food, however, to place on an adjacent section. So in this section or this section, 1 food. And it costs 3 food to place in any non-adjacent section. The descending cost is 0 food on the top terrace, which is where the worker currently is, 2 food on the middle terrace, and 5 food on the bottom terrace. The descending cost is decreased by 2 food for each steps marker above the space in question in the same section. So in this case, if the worker was placed here, instead of 5 food, they would only pay 1 food since there are 2 steps, decreasing the cost by a total of 4. If the owner of the steps is someone other than the active player, they gain 1 victory point every time their steps are used. Also, it is mandatory that if steps are available, they must be used. Each space, as we've mentioned, is marked with a God symbol and is adjacent to 3 tasks. The player can perform tasks related to these icons after placing the worker. But first, the player must determine the number of tasks they may perform. They automatically receive 1 task just for placing the worker. Let's say this was the worker that was placed. Special abilities of different workers, depending on their color, may grant additional tasks. As it turns out, green workers get 1 additional task for placing their worker on a green god icon. Also, each adjacent worker of the same color grants 1 task. Workers are considered adjacent if they are on the same terrace, as these 2 are, and they are connected to the player's worker via a common path through exactly 1 task icon, as you see here. So, for this worker being placed here, the player is granted 3 tasks. Once the player has determined their total number of tasks, they will resolve these one at a time using the 3 adjacent task icons. The player must distribute tasks as evenly as possible among those 3 task icons. As soon as the player is unable to respect the rules for splitting tasks, they must stop and forgo any remaining tasks. So for instance, if the player had 3 tasks and they performed this one and then this one, but then they were unable to perform this one for whatever reason, they couldn't then take that 3rd task and assign it here or here since it's no longer evenly distributed. When the player places a worker, if the god card they used also matches 1 statue they currently possess, they may take the benefits of the god card as well. The player may take this benefit before or after resolving any tasks, and taking this benefit is entirely optional. If the god card has multiple benefits on it, the player may take 1, all, or none of them. At the end of a player's turn, they add the god card to the central offer. The central offer has a maximum capacity based on the player count. So if this would be the 4th card placed in a 2-player game, the 5th in a 3-player game, or the 6th in a 4-player game, then first remove all god cards from the central offer and shuffle them back into the draw deck. Only after doing this does the player place their played card into the offer. Also, when a player places a worker if they pay gold instead of a god card, it should be noted that this allows the player to place the worker on any god symbol. However, they do not receive any associated benefit even if they have a matching statue. Each color worker has a special ability that activates when placed. The blue workers, which are architects, allow the player to perform 1 additional task when placed on a blue space. The craftsmen, which are green workers, allow the player 1 additional task when placed on a green space. When a warrior, which is the red worker, is placed, the player draws 1 army card, and then they may retrieve 1 adjacent non-warrior worker from the board into their supply. When the yellow worker, which is the courier, is placed, the player pays one fewer roaming and descending cost. Keep in mind that step discounts still apply. Additionally, if this is the first worker placed in a segment, the player performs an additional task. In a two-player game, workers placed during setup are considered for this purpose. When the white worker, which is a priest, is placed, the player may pay one potato to gain one task for this worker. This may be done once per placement. The player may then draw a god card from either the deck or the offer after resolving tasks. So let's discuss these tasks in a little bit more detail. Any task that shows a resource allows the player to gain the indicated type and number of resources shown. This task allows the player to build steps. The cost to build steps is 3 stone. Upon building steps, player immediately scores 4 victory points and receives 1 corn and 2 potatoes. Steps markers have dedicated spaces on the board, and the player may build steps on any valid empty step space, regardless of the section into which they place their worker. In each section, the player may build the lower steps only if the upper space already has steps in them. When the player builds the lower steps, the owner of the upper steps immediately scores 2 victory points. This means that even if the player who builds these steps is the owner of these steps, they will receive 2 victory points for the upper steps. However, it is important to remember that when an opponent uses these steps to decrease the descending cost of placing a worker, the owner will receive 1 victory point as long as the owner is not the same player placing the worker. But the owner does still get the cost reduction of using the steps. To construct a building, the player pays the cost found in the top right corner of any building in the building market, so 2 potatoes and 1 stone. The player then plays that building into their play area. At the end of the player's turn, they will replenish the building market as we've previously discussed. Production buildings like this one, indicated by this symbol, provide resources or victory points. However, their benefits must be triggered, which we'll discuss a little later. Passive buildings, on the other hand, provide an ongoing ability. Detailed descriptions of all passive buildings can be found in Appendix 1 on page 19 of the rulebook. Prior to purchasing a building from the building market, the player may discard 1 god card to the bottom of the god deck to get rid of any 2 buildings from the market. They're placed at the bottom of the appropriate pile, and then the market is refreshed. When the buildings are placed at the bottom of their appropriate pile, they may be placed in whatever order the player chooses. If the player resolves the build a statue task, the player may build either a small or large statue. A small statue costs 3 stone and immediately scores the player 3 victory points. Large statues cost 3 stone and 2 gold and immediately score the player 9 victory points. It's important to note that even if the player builds statues in some other way than the task, they still gain the victory points indicated. As we mentioned, statues can be used to trigger the benefits on god cards, but they also can be discarded when performing the worship actions with the high priest, which we'll discuss in just a little bit. When performing the Purchase Weavings task, the player draws 3 weaving tiles from the top of the pile, including the one that's already face up. The player then looks at all 3 and chooses none, some, or all to purchase. If the player purchases 1, it will cost 1 corn. If they purchase 2, it will cost 3 corn. And if they purchase all 3, it will cost 6 corn. Now let's say this player purchases just 1 weaving. Any weavings the player does not purchase are offered to the other players in turn order. Each player may purchase 1 leftover weaving for 3 corn. After all players have had an opportunity to purchase the leftover weavings, any remaining weavings are placed face down at the bottom of the weaving stack. Finally, reveal the top weaving. If any ability grants the player one or more weavings, they may take the face-up tile or the tile beneath it at no additional cost. Other players do not have the opportunity to purchase weavings when an effect like this is triggered. Weavings form tapestries in the form of rows of weavings like this. Each player may have one or multiple tapestries, but each tapestry must be composed of weavings with different patterns. When a player gains a weaving, they must immediately add it to either end of the existing tapestry. Or they could start a new tapestry. For instance, with this one, they already have this pattern in this tapestry, so they would start a new one. There are 7 different weaving patterns, some more common than others. Once placed, weavings cannot be rearranged and tapestries cannot be split or merged. The icons at the edge of weavings do not have to match for a weaving to be added to a tapestry. However, if they do match, as you see here, the player will receive that resource or benefit every time the merchant action is used. At the end of the game, players will receive victory points based on the length of their tapestry. Speaking of the merchant task, it is simply a task that allows a player to gain whatever benefits are matching on their tapestries, in this case, 1 gold. The training task allows the player to draw 2 army cards, look at them, keep one, and discard the other to the discard pile. If the army deck ever completely empties, the discard pile will be shuffled into a new deck. At any point during the player's turn, they may perform a free action to discard army cards to gain the resource indicated at the bottom of the card. There is no limit to the number of times the player may perform this free action, but it must be done on their turn. Army cards also depict 1 or 2 soldiers on them. These soldiers are relevant when taking the Conquest High Priest action, or having them in greater numbers results in more and or better conquests. The Produce 1 task allows the player to immediately receive the shown benefits of one of their face-up production buildings. In this case, corn or potato, and then 3 victory points. This building remains face-up. Instead of placing a worker, the player may choose 2 different secondary actions to perform, and they perform them in any order. Often these actions allow other players, in turn order, to perform some version of the action as well. The 4 secondary actions are High Priest, Praying, Training, and Recruiting. To take the High Priest secondary action, the player moves their High Priest 1 or 2 spaces around the Coricancha. They then trigger the action they land on for all players. The active player may always choose to gain 1 gold instead of taking the action associated with the activation. If they do, the other players may still perform that action, and the other players can never choose to gain 1 gold instead. This is the worship action. All players may discard statues from their player area to advance on the temple track. The active player may discard 1 large statue to advance 3 steps, and or 1 small statue to advance 1 step. The active player may not discard more than 1 of each size. Other players may discard 1 large statue or 1 small statue, and regardless of the size of statue they discard, they move 1 step on the track. Statues discarded in this way are removed from the game. This is the offering action. The player may pay 2 corn to advance 1 step on the temple, 4 corn to advance 2, or 6 corn to advance 3. Other players may pay 3 corn to advance 1. Immediately upon initiating Conquest, the active player must select a worker from either end of the village queue and place it in the Casualties of War section. If the village happens to be empty, the player selects from the nomads instead. If the player selected from the nomads, they immediately draw a new worker from the bag and replace the one they took. All players may now play any number of army cards from their hand to the area in front of themselves at a cost of 1 potato per card. The active player gets to play the first army card for free, so 2 would only cost them 1 potato. Each army card depicts either 1 or 2 soldiers. Each conquest space depicts a benefit as well as the number of soldiers required for Conquest. All soldiers used for Conquest must come from the player's play area and not from their hand. The number next to a skull indicates the number of soldiers that must be discarded from the player's play area for Conquest of that area. So if we were performing Conquest against this area here, the player would have to discard 2 soldiers. The number next to the arrow shows the number of soldiers that must be flipped face down. These soldiers do stay in the player's play area, however. After all players who choose to do so have played their desired army cards in turn order, starting with the active player, each player who still has available Conquest markers may place 1 Conquest marker on an empty Conquest space in any region, and then immediately gain the benefits indicated, in this case, 4 gold, and then pay the required cost as we mentioned before. In this case, discard 2, flip face down 3. The active player may place 1 additional Conquest marker, gaining the benefits and discarding and/or flipping down the appropriate number of soldiers. Face down cards will be able to be flipped back up using the Rejuvenate action, which we'll discuss shortly. When taking the Produce action, the active player receives the benefits of any number of their face-up production buildings, then flips those buildings face down. Before or after doing so, the active player may choose 1 face-down production building to flip face-up. After the active player has resolved this, every other player may also receive the benefits shown on any number of their own face-up production buildings, then flip those buildings face down. You'll notice that the non-active players don't have the opportunity to flip any buildings face up at this point. However, face down production buildings can later be flipped back up using the Rejuvenate action, which we'll explain next. When the active player takes the Rejuvenate action, all players may pay to flip face up any number of face down production buildings and/or army cards. The active player may pay 1 food, either corn or potatoes, for each that they wish to flip face up. The active player also gets to flip the first one for free. Other players, however, must pay corn, not potatoes, per building or army card they wish to flip face up. When taking the Praying secondary action, the active player may take 2 God cards in any combination from the offer and the deck. If the player chooses to draw from the deck first, they may then look at the card before deciding what to do next. The Training secondary action allows the player to take 2 army cards from the deck, look at them, and discard 1 to the discard pile. This is identical to the training task we previously described. When taking the Recruiting secondary action, the player takes 1 Nomad worker from the Nomad worker space, and then immediately replaces it with 1 worker from the draw bag. If the bag is empty, then do not replace the worker. At the end of a player's turn, they may purchase a single worker from the village. To do so, the player will either spend 1 corn or 1 potato. If the player spends a corn, they'll purchase the worker on this end of the queue. If they spend a potato, they'll purchase the worker on this end of the queue. If there happens to be only 1 worker in the village, the player may spend either corn or potato. Purchasing the final worker empties the village and triggers the festival, which we'll discuss momentarily. Every player has a maximum limit of 2 workers they may have at the end of their turn. This is enforced after the purchase of a worker. So in this case, after purchasing a worker, the player has 3 workers and will have to discard 1 from the game. It's important to remember that this enforcement of a 2-worker limit only occurs at the end of a player's turn. So during a player's turn, they may have more workers than 2, but it does not matter until the end of their turn. Every time the village completely empties, the active player takes the festival token and then scores the indicated number of victory points. 1 the first time, 2 the second time the village empties, and 4 the third time the village empties. The third festival also marks the end of the game is near. Every time the festival is triggered, each other player gets 1 more turn, and then the following turn of the player holding the festival token, the festival begins. Festivals are resolved in the following order. First, players all get a free merchant action. Players then receive the victory points to the right of their current position on the temple track. They also receive the resources depicted to the left of their current position on the temple track. If a player happens to be in these top spaces of the temple track, they only receive these victory points on the right during the festival. The victory points in the middle of the track are for the end of the game scoring. Check each conquest region. The player who has the most conquest markers scores victory points equal to the current number of workers in the casualties of war area. So if there were 2 workers as casualties of war, the black player would earn 2 victory points for this region. Ties are broken in favor of the player with the rightmost conquest marker, so in this case, the black player would still win the region. Players must pay 1 potato for every god card in their hand. If players are unable to play, if players do not have enough potatoes to pay, they lose 2 victory points for each potato they are unable to pay. If any player must lose more victory points than they currently have, their marker remains at 0. Players are not able to have negative points. If this is the 3rd festival, the players will proceed to the end of the game and final scoring. Otherwise, return the festival token next to the game board, then draw additional workers to refill the village. It is possible for the draw bag to run out of workers before the village is refilled. In this case, simply place all remaining workers on the village. It is very rare, but also possible, for no workers to remain in the bag before refilling. In this case, immediately trigger the next festival. In this case, the player who had the festival token previously receives it again and gains the associated victory points. Then each player, this time including the player holding the festival marker, plays a single turn before evaluating the next and last festival. If playing with 2 players after the first festival, on every space on the middle terrace with the 2-player symbol, draw a worker from the bag and place them on that symbol. If any of those symbols happen to already have workers on them, skip them. Finally, proceed to the festival card draw phase. After the first and second festival, players draw god cards from the deck, not from the offer. This is done starting with the player with the fewest victory points and proceeds to the player with the most victory points. This is done in the order of the player with the fewest victory points to the player with the most victory points. In a 4-player game, the 2 players with the fewest victory points will draw 2 cards each. Then the 2 players with the most victory points will draw 1 card each. In a 3-player game, the player with the fewest victory points draws 2 cards, the player with the second fewest draws 2 cards, and then the player with the most draws 1 card. In a 2-player game, the player with the fewest victory points draws 2 cards, and the player with the most draws 1 card. If tied, the player closest to the active player in clockwise turn order is considered to have more victory points. After drawing these cards in turn order, each player may play up to 3 god cards to receive any benefits depicted on them. Cards used in this way should be shuffled back into the draw deck and do not affect the card offer. At the end of this step, if any buildings remain in the building market, remove them by placing them at the bottom of their building stack and then refill the market. Keep in mind throughout the game, whenever the player receives a free worker from a god card or a temple reward or any other ability, they take the worker from the nomads and then immediately refill the nomads with a new worker from the bag. If the bag is empty, if at any point there are no workers in the nomad space, then do not receive the free worker. Anytime the player advances on the temple track, they gain the benefit listed on the left side of the track. If the player moves multiple steps, they gain all resources shown to the left of each step on which they advanced. Also keep in mind that any number of players may occupy a single step. After the third and final festival, each player receives victory points as follows. Each tapestry is scored based on the number of weavings in the tapestry. A tapestry with 1 weaving is worth 0 points. If it has 2 weavings, it's worth 1 point. Then 3, then 6, then 10 for this tapestry here, and then 15, and then 21. If the player has reached one of the top 4 steps of the temple track, they receive the victory points printed in the center of that step. The player receives 2 victory points per face-up building, 1 victory point per god card currently in hand, 1 victory point per army card currently face up in the player area. No points are given for army cards in hand. 1 victory point per worker left in their supply. And 1 victory point for each gold in their supply. The player with the most victory points wins. In the case of a tie, the tied player with the most resources wins. If still tied, then the tied players share the victory. So there you go. That's everything you need to know to play Tawantinsuyu. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up. Give the channel a subscribe. Click on the bell. All that good stuff. And until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.